In about 3 weeks, there's going to be a changing of the guard in SISO. Lou Schomer is going to be retiring, and this gentleman, David Audrain, will be stepping in on December 1st. Let's give him a big round of applause, a big EDPA welcome to David Audrain.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I know it's Friday, and I know it's your last day, so I'm impressed you're all here. It's a good start. I appreciate Jeff giving me an opportunity to pontificate on one of my favorite subjects. I did warn him yesterday. I was in Baltimore at IAEE, and if I'm a little croakier than normal, I have some head cold going on, and yesterday morning I woke up without a voice. So I warned Jeff yesterday that we might be doing this with hand signals and writing as we went through, but it came back for the most part. If it disappears halfway through, forgive me. This is first of all, I'm here in my show organizer, wearing my show organizer hat, not SISO. And so I have this little caveat at the bottom. This is all personal viewpoints. This is not SISO's viewpoint. This is not, I'm a past chair of IAEE as well. It's not, I'm on the SEER board, but none of those, I'm not speaking on behalf of any of those organizations. This is all me. And talking about me, a lot of you are new to me. I haven't met very many of you. Sorry I didn't make it in last night in time to say hello. I'm a show organizer. And in fact, am I the only one in the room? Am I the only show organizer in the room? Okay, so I feel a little bit like a salmon in a tank full of sharks at the moment, but that's all right. I've been producing shows for 20 plus years. I came from a completely different background. Most of the show organizers you meet are like me. We all fell into it by accident. Very few of us plan, unless you're a second or third generation, and there are a number of those coming up. Most of us fell into it. And I came from a computer software background. I grew up, as you can tell, not from Texas, but from Europe. And in fact, I notice there's a number of Europeans in here. How many Europeans in the room? Good. You can all go to sleep now because there's nothing we're going to talk about here that's going to relate to you all at all. I was lucky enough to get into the show business by accident, working for an association, the first part, the only association I ever actually worked for before. And I ran a small event in Texas, the Texas Restaurant Association show, and that was my entree into running shows. I then started getting headhunted to Miller Freeman, back when Miller Freeman was the biggest in the world. I ran some shows called Bobbin. Some of you may remember the Bobbin show as it was back in the 90s and 80s and 90s when it was something, before it went away. I then ended up at Hanley Wood, Avanstar, ran the Magic men's apparel shows, that group for a while. Nothing wrong with 1 million square foot every 6 months. It works. And surfaces, and got involved with a number of the Hanley Wood shows. And then I partnered up here in Vegas. I ended up living in Vegas not with Chuck Schwartz, but partnered with Chuck Schwartz running the SEMA show and a number of other automotive shows. Definitely the most fun I ever had. Nothing wrong with customized cars, thousands of them. Had a lot of fun with that. And then I got headhunted by Messe Frankfurt. I ran Messe Frankfurt's business for 6.5 years in North America and launched a lot of shows for them. And spent a lot of time in Europe with our colleagues over there. So that's why I have an opinion on most things. So Jeff asked me to talk about the model, and I've been sort of talking about this a lot over the last few years. Sometimes people do it under the heading, it's broken. How do we fix it? Well, I don't necessarily believe that the trade show model is broken. Far from it. In fact, if you look at the latest SEER statistics, we're at the highest point we've ever been in terms of numbers of shows, numbers of attendees, exhibitors. We're still continuing to grow. We've already made back the last recession. We keep having all these recessions. But we're already back past the 2009 numbers. The index continues to grow. And so the industry is a very healthy industry. The challenge, as we'll talk about, is the viewpoint of our mutual customers. The customers don't really like doing shows for the most part, and that's probably our biggest challenge. So we always, one of my favorite deals is, dealers and addicts. How did we get here? Well, the first score was that first roll. I don't know who gave away that first roll of aisle carpet, but whoever did started the whole trend. And we get to that point where it started with a roll of aisle carpet and a free reg counter, and it got to the point where basically we as organizers pay for nothing. That's why we have such great margins, because we've shifted all the costs off to everybody else. It's a great model as an organizer. There's nothing, you certainly can't argue with it. But what it's done is it's created that negative connection between participating in a show for exhibitors and the unexplainable costs that come with it. And it's great from an organizer's perspective because we have these huge margins, but they're not realistic margins because they don't take into account the actual cost of doing a show. And it gets to a point where we start having to explain, or in most cases, what happens is we don't explain, we just point fingers. I say, well, that's not, I don't handle the labor, it's not my problem. I don't, drayage is this magical thing that happens the back of the convention center, and it just everything materializes, and it's not my fault. So why is it so different here in the U.S.? That's the question. And the Europeans here always come over and they say, what is this whole drayage thing? Why do we have this? And the reality is that's how the aisle carpet gets paid for, right? And so it's happened here over the last decades, and we've gotten to the point where it's just too big to change, most people think. I've talked to a lot of my general contractor friends and a lot of other organizers that do shows, and they just don't think it's possible to change. They think, well, we can't possibly change it. But the reality is it can change. And why, I say, why does it matter? The reality is that exhibitors have to pay for everything that happens in a show. It's just the model that's out there. Very few of us have significant revenue streams from attendance, of even sponsorships. The reality is that anywhere between 80 and 99% of our revenue comes from the exhibitors. So they are having to pick up the tab. And that's fine if the event creates the right value. And what we're seeing is that, unfortunately, too many times, exhibitors start focusing on the negatives and not on the actual value of the show. And we start having to explain ourselves, and the conversation goes off of what they're getting from the show onto what they're paying for the show. And that's ultimately the downside to a lot of the events that are out there. And the last point here, we're seeing, the US has the biggest trade show market, the biggest business market, it's the biggest economy. But if you start looking at some of the shows out there, there are bigger events, global events in other parts of the world, a lot of them. When I worked for Messe Frankfurt, when I first started going to Frankfurt and started seeing the shows that were there, it blew me away. I've been to a lot of European shows, but the quality of the shows in Europe is outstanding. And the business, more importantly, the business that gets done at those shows is outstanding. Now, we have fantastic shows here. Say, the SEMA show that was one of the most fun things I ever did. And the amount of business and the volume of people that are there is second to none. So you certainly can't go to a SEMA show or a Magic or any ConExpo or CES and say, your show sucks. It's wrong. You're not doing it right. Because they're obviously doing it right. They're getting a lot of business. But that's the very, very top of the scale. So Jeff asked me, talk about the changes that are coming and happening. And they are coming, and we're seeing change, but it is happening very slowly. I started changing the model for my business 10 years ago. And we've seen more and more change happening because the customers are actually demanding it. They're saying, I'm not going to pay those ridiculous charges. But when you turn around and say, well, okay, well then let's package it all up, they say, fine. We're seeing more and more inclusive pricing. We're seeing more and more turnkey packages. We're now seeing, all of you I'm sure have heard about Reed's business model of the last few years. They've been going onto a variable pricing model. It used to always be that we had flat rates. When we sold exhibit space, it was $20 a foot, whatever, at the front of the hall, the back of the hall, the side of the hall, wherever it was. It was always the same rate. Reed changed that model several years ago, and they call it variable pricing. Basically, they have variable rates depending on where in the hall you are. So they're actually recognizing the fact that we've all denied for years that there is better space than others. We all deny it and say, no, the people walk the whole show. And, some do. But the reality is Reed said, no, this booth here is worth more than that booth there. And I think they've done it to almost all their shows now, and worldwide as well. So we're likely to see more of that, more recognizing the value and the return that people are getting. We, on the organizer side, talk at length about how do we price for value. And it's very difficult. If you rent space in a mall, sometimes you pay on a percentage of revenue. And that's a little easier to track. They've got a business, you've got a restaurant sitting there, they can actually audit their revenue on a yearly basis, and they can charge them a percentage of revenue. We've talked about it, but it's, ideally we'd be able to say, hey, we'll take a piece of the sales you do. How do you track it? That's the challenge. And we've been talking about this for years. So we still are in the business of selling space, even though we don't like to talk about that. We like to talk about the fact that we're selling opportunities and we're partnering with our customers. The reality is we still base it on space. We still sell space. And so what we've seen more of are these packages. I started 10 years ago doing basic turnkey packages in some of our shows in New York. And building hardwall packages in New York, as we all know, is not exactly the cheapest thing in the world. So we started just creating standard, and in this particular case, we did it because we had sourcing shows. We were launching these sourcing shows in New York, and 95% of our exhibitors were overseas companies. So they weren't used to the American model. They certainly didn't like paper and drape, and they wanted to be comfortable that they knew what they were getting. And so we created European-style packages for them. We even sold it in square meters. And these were not cheap packages. These were, these shows are still going, and they're in the $700 a meter range. So they're not cheap. They're not cheap shows, but they are full turnkey packages. You turn up with a rolling bag full of samples, and you're done. And you've got everything: lights, power, furniture, walls. Everything is taken care of. Now we had to work differently with our contractor at the time because obviously that wasn't the model. They were used to getting all their revenue from the exhibitors, and not being able to charge anybody but us, we had to obviously go through a whole pricing model with them to determine how they could still make money, not too much, and how we were able to make it a fluid, seamless issue with our exhibitors. And this is what the exhibitors keep telling us. They want clear costs. It's not so much that they don't want to pay, because they obviously do pay. They come to shows and they pay. But what they want is they want clear costs. They want to know what the cost is going to be before they get there. And they don't want surprises. Nobody likes surprises, unless it's a birthday. Everybody wants to know exactly what they're going to end up so they can budget. They want it to be easy. They don't want to be fighting and lining up and standing at counters and looking for people. They want it taken care of. And they want to know that it's going to be easy for them to participate in a show. I have some shows right now that my partner and I have launched the last few years, small regional local shows. They're not overly attended. Our attendance is a little lighter than we'd like, but they're starting to grow. They're in their infancy still. And I have exhibitors every edition come up to me and say, hey, yours isn't the best attended show. It isn't it's certainly not the busiest show, and I'd certainly like to see a few more people here, but it sure is the easiest show we do. It's not the cheapest either, by any stretch. But they walk out of there without feeling annoyed. And that makes a lot of difference. So they keep coming back, and they stick with us and support us as we build and develop the show. And it's all about value. We're trying to create value for these people. This is a story I've told a number of people. The turning point for me came 10 years ago was when this first one of these turnkey shows we did in New York. Before we did the full package, we had a somewhat traditional. It was, you still had to order furniture and everything else. And I found this poor little Chinese lady outside the exhibitor service desk in tears. And I thought, wow, I wonder who upset her. And I tried to find out what was going on. It turned out she'd gotten a bill for, I forget, $80 for one chair that they had ordered on site and they hadn't expected. And she was now assured that she was going to get fired when she went back to China because they hadn't budgeted for this any extra cost at all. And this $80 chair was just, you know, she was apoplectic. She was sure she was going to get fired, and that was it. And all I could think of was this is the end of the show. This company's participated in our show. We actually had good attendance. Most of the people did good business. And all she could think about was the fact that she had this $80 bill to deal with on the way back to China. Nothing about the value of the show, the business they did, nothing else. This was all that mattered to her. And that was sort of that light bulb that went off for me. You know, even for years I'd been explaining and justifying drayage and rates and everything else to all our customers, and it just, at that point, I sort of said, okay, enough's enough, I'm done. And from that point on, the last 10 years, we, at Frankfurt and my own company, we've been developing these turnkey shows to handle and make sure that we don't have those situations anymore. We want to keep people focused on the people they're seeing and the business they're doing, not on the costs that come out of being in the show. This is an example of that show. You'll see, even though this is a standard turnkey package show, this is one of those companies that did it right. All they had to do is roll in with some graphics or have somebody put some graphics up. It's all racks, and we made it easy. We'd say they would simply have a form that all they had to do was tell us, do you want racks, do you want shelves, do you want, give us the height, you know, what do you want? What do you want in the booth? Make it easy. You know, we're going to have lights, we're going to have power, we're going to have furniture. It's all turnkey. Just tell me what you need, and we'll have it set up for you when you get there. Obviously, we've had to throw in a few threats on penalties and things. If you don't tell us and you have to change it on site, then you're going to get charged. Of course, we didn't, but we had to threaten them a little bit so they'd actually tell us in advance. This is another one of my, this one's actually in Mexico. This is one of my shows in Mexico City we've done. Same concept. Obviously, Mexico, it's a lot different. Different labor, different costs. You know, that's one of the, obviously, the big issues. I can build this booth in Mexico City for about 15% of what it cost me to build in New York. I don't know what else to say. Now, this is one of our, you know, traditional pipe and drape shows, but again, package show. Tables, carpet, power. Now, what we're doing here is we're negotiating basically bulk buying on behalf of our customers. I'm going to the building and saying, okay, I'm going to take out the need for you to sell your electrical services, provide the customer service, do the billing, do the collecting. I'm going to take all of that off of your shoulders. Now, what's my rate if I need 200 drops in the show? And I negotiate that rate, and that keeps my rates down. The building's still getting it. Frankly, they're probably getting more revenue than they would have got trying to sell individually, because half these guys wouldn't even order a drop, mostly. They just try to find a plug somewhere. And so we're making it simple for them on that side. Same with even the material handling. What I'm doing is I'm bringing in forklifts and labor, and I'm telling the exhibitors, you want to bring in a flatbed and push your own stuff around, by all means, but I'm going to have a forklift and labor standing there to do it for you. You just need to show up and bring it in. What I'm trying to do, in particular in these shows, these are food service related shows, I'm trying to bring the equipment guys back. A lot of these shows, a lot of these regional food service shows have lost all the equipment because the drayage costs and the aggravation factor of bringing in heavy equipment just got too much, and they stopped exhibiting. You know, the restaurant show I ran in the 90s was full of equipment. The restaurant shows now around the country have very little of it, except obviously Chicago's doing great. But the regional ones have lost most of it. So by offering these no drayage turnkey package deals, I'm trying to bring the content back to the shows to provide value for the attendees to actually find stuff they want. Make it simple. Even things like here, we even took over all the issues in Georgia. This is a show in Georgia. I had to negotiate with the liquor authorities to handle, and with the building to make sure all this liquor sampling was easy. And we had to take all of that off their shoulders. So all the exhibitors have to do is just let us know they're coming in, and we take care of handling everything. In some cases, we even act as the intermediary. We invoice them. They invoice us, and we invoice building invoices us, and we invoice the customer back. Anyway, we end up just whatever it takes to make it easy for them to come in is what the goal is. How can we make it easy for them to exhibit? It's not the cost. Yes, cost is always an issue. An exhibitor that says, hey, I'm not going to, I can't afford $5,000 to be in a show, $3,000 to be in a show, $30,000 to be in a show. They're saying that they're not seeing the return. That's the key. So then it's a whole different conversation. Then we're saying, well, who are you trying to see? Here's our sample attendee list. Here's the top 200 companies that are coming to the show. Are these potential customers? No. Well, then you shouldn't be in the show. That's a different conversation than cost. If you want to sell to these 200 companies or these 2,000 companies or whomever, then how do we justify? Can we justify for you that is a value that you can afford to be in? It's also, we acknowledge the fact that the exhibit space is not the only cost. In a traditional show format, we all know that the actual cost of space is 20-25% of the total cost of participating for a mid-size exhibitor, right? Smaller ones may be cheaper, larger ones may be even less. So we're looking at their total cost of participation, and we're trying to work with them to help them connect. That's why you're seeing more and more of these matchmaking type events. I run another event, a cybersecurity event, where it's actually a conference we don't even call them exhibitors, we call them sponsors. Because we've got a limited number, we only have 50, 60 companies that can be part of the conference. We give them exhibit display space, and again, we turnkey everything so that they can show up with pop-ups and whatever else they need. But they're sponsors, and the conference is the draw. And it's very simple. Here's 1,000 people that you want to connect with, and you've got 3 days to connect with them. And we develop all the interaction tools for them to actually work with it. Again, focusing on the bottom line. What's the value? How much business can you walk away with? Because if an exhibitor walks away from a show and hasn't done any business, then I've failed. First of all, he either shouldn't have been in the show, or we're not bringing the right people, or he's just not very good. And if he's not very good, he's probably not going to be around next year to be in the show anyway. And we can see some of those. But we're getting rid of the individual costs. No longer are we having these conversations with people that say, my drainage bill was $1,000, and all I did was bring in some brochures. Those conversations have gone out the window. I don't see lines of people at service desks anymore. I don't get those complaints in the surveys after the show about the cost of furniture or the labor costs or anything else. We don't get those issues anymore because we've eliminated those. Now we focus based just on the quality of the attendance. And what I hope to see is obviously people upgrading their participation, bringing in more equipment, bringing in more displays, because we want to see the quality of the events. I love European shows. I want to see more of those. And if the US is going to develop more global business and more global participation, we've got to make it easier for foreign participants, foreign exhibitors, to exhibit with us. We've got to make it so that they want to be here. Because otherwise, the key shows are going to end up being in China and Europe. And we're going to end up with just domestic shows. And from an industry perspective, I don't want to see that. Supply and demand, variable pricing, package pricing. I talked about the variable pricing a little bit, and we're seeing there's more talk about that, there's more interest in that, but a lot of us are still a little concerned. Nobody pays rack rate for a hotel room anymore, right? Nobody pays rack rate for a plane ticket anymore. The one thing we've sort of had left in the great scheme of life is that, exhibit space is flat priced, and we don't discount. I've never discounted a booth in my life in 20-odd years of running shows. We create different rates. Traditionally in the old days, you'd have a member rate, non-member rate, especially all the association shows. Well, that's now expanded. Now we've got early bird rates, early bird member, early bird non-member, standard member to standard non-member, and then what Reed's doing, and some others are following, which is basically the zone rates. You know, you want to be front and center, it's zone A. You want to be on the periphery, it's zone B. You want to be by the bathrooms, it's zone C. And that's starting to become more. I'm curious to see, they tell me it's working great for them. They're very happy with it. And I suspect that with large-scale shows, they started with their biggest shows, you always have the flexibility of basically doing what you want. But with smaller launch shows, I know with my launches, and I've done 11 launches in the last 10 years, and 9 of them are still going, which beats most odds. It would be very difficult for me to have non-published rates because people would talk and it would become very difficult to get people to buy. We have early bird, we have standard, we have member, we have non-member, but they're all published and they're all fixed. And so we continue, but we also throw in those packages. What's interesting is we're not getting as much credit for the cost that we've absorbed as we would think or we would hope we would get. And that's part of the communication challenge, is we'll get people and they'll say, oh, well, you know, I carry in my own boxes anyway. So the fact that you're covering all the drayage and all the labor is irrelevant to me. I'm like, well, okay, but maybe you don't want to. Maybe you want to bring in some heavy equipment, and you don't have to carry it in now. So we're having to educate our customers a little more than we thought we would, because we're just not getting they're not seeing the value that we're adding in all these costs. And that's why a lot of people, frankly, are still not doing it. That's why most of the people aren't doing it. Because if you've got an established show and you're charging $20 a foot right now, and exhibitors are paying for everything else, they're afraid of having to go back to them and say, okay, we just raised the rates to $35 a foot. But we've included the carpet and the electrical and the drayage and everything else because they're afraid. They're afraid that the exhibitors won't buy it and won't take it on. On the for-profit side, our challenge is, of course, margins. All of our shows are sold based on EBITDA rates, and the big private equity guys love this business because they love the cash flow and they love the margins. And you know, when you have a 1 million square foot show with a 60% margin, you don't want to suddenly have a 40% margin, even if you got more revenue. The mathematician in me doesn't see the problem with that, but that's just me. One of the things I have seen that's interesting, I was in a show in London 6 weeks ago, and it was at Olympia, and it's a relatively small venue, as you know, and it was a nice show, a few thousand people, a couple of hundred exhibitors, typical European stands. But what was interesting was that I saw a lot of, because it was sold out, it was a full event, they had basically filled every nook and cranny. And I saw booths literally as small as 3 square meters. I saw 4 square meter booths and 6 square meter booths, a 3 square meter booth. I even swear I saw one guy with a 2 square meter booth in this little corner. And I thought about it, and I thought, okay, well, you know, again, over here, very few shows do anything less than 10 by 10s. We sell 10 by 10s, that's it. But what this show had done is they probably could have gone to a bigger venue, and they probably could have forced people into minimum 9 square meter booths. But they had recognized that they had a limited attendance, so they didn't want to spread it out too much. So they had a strong traffic flow, but they wanted as many companies in as they could. And so they were addressing the fact that these companies couldn't necessarily justify 9 square meters, some of these smaller companies. So they probably had dozens of companies in that were still willing to pay what was probably $500 a meter to be in the show. They just weren't willing to pay for 9 square meters. And so they got more companies, more products, and therefore more attraction to the buyers in this smaller space. And it was, you wouldn't see a show like that in the States, not just because it was Hardwall, but because of the fact that it was not a standard 9 square meter, 100 square foot layout. It was directed to squeeze as much in as possible of product, not just dollars, pounds, but of product, to get people to have as much to see and interact with and do as much business as possible. And it made me think that they're doing something right, because they had great traffic, and it was a great little segmented show. And I see more opportunity for that sort of event over here as we continue to develop. The good news is the country, back in late 90s, I was at Miller Freeman, and it was the internet crush that was coming on. And I headed up a division in Dallas, and I also was like their tech guy, because I came from a software background. And literally every day, somebody would call me and tell me that they had the latest and greatest web-based tool that was going to create virtual shows and eliminate the need for trade shows. Every day, I got these calls. I don't get them every day anymore, thank goodness, but we still see it out there. I'm one of those ones that thinks that virtual trade show is an oxymoron, that there is no such thing as trade shows are face-to-face, full stop. The web's great. The internet is the biggest tool we as organizers have had to market our shows ever, and to continue the interaction between our customers ever. But face-to-face isn't going away. We all know that. I don't care what happens out there. I don't care what, I've got every gadget known to man. But nothing beats face-to-face. These sourcing shows I ran in New York were fabric shows. Find me a manufacturer that will buy a piece of fabric online without touching it, and I'll find you a guy who's going to be out of business next week. Shows need, that we need shows, and the stats show that that's going to continue. We've had face-to-face marketplaces for hundreds, if not thousands of years. It's coming, it's going to keep coming, it's going to keep growing. But what we are seeing is we're seeing exhibitors take less space. We're seeing exhibitors build lighter, smaller, less busy booths. Some of it's a good thing. I think, personally, I'm a big fan of, of not wasting money on irrelevant aspects on a booth. It should be about product and interaction for the most part. But we are seeing that that's a cause for ROI. They're demanding better ROI. We're seeing a lot of technology coming out today about tracking the interaction on show floors. I was in Baltimore this week at IEEE, and on their Expo floor, probably more technology than ever, and more people with tools to create tracking for interaction. And I think, personally, that's going to continue for a long time. And I think it's a good thing. We've always said RFID never really took off because, again, people weren't willing to pay for it. But more and more, we're seeing now tracking tools where people can just use their iPhones to connect with people. I saw a system in Baltimore where basically it was seamless. These chips in the badges could be tracked by an exhibitor's cell phone immediately they came in their booth. That's kind of development's going to continue. We're going to see more of that. But of course, as organizers, the demands on us are always to create bigger shows. That means if exhibitors are taking less space and we need to grow our shows, the only way to do that is to bring more people into the space. That means we've got to get more companies to see the value of exhibiting at trade shows. And that's why I think it's going to become a need for us to create packages and create seamless experiences so that these new companies, especially these millennial-driven companies that are coming along now in the next 10 years, are going to find it valuable and easy to participate in our shows.